This is Ever Deeper Honesty. It's a free book online. You can get it in PDF form or Google Docs. I'm going to link it in the description. It's a very straightforward book. And even though it's 1,193 pages, you don't have to read the whole book. You only have to read the first 45 pages, which is what I'm going to do for this channel. And the author is anonymous, which I respect a lot. They really just wanted to get it out there, and I do too. I don't know too many people that have read this or heard about it, so I wanted to get the word out there about this book. So, Ever Deeper Honesty: How to Reduce, Prevent, Eliminate Suffering, and Get Ever Deeper Freedom, Peace, Love, Bliss, and that. So I'm skipping some of this. He kind of just summarizes the format of the book, split into two parts, blah, blah, blah. So they actually start with a conclusion, which is one sentence, very straightforward. There is no freedom, choice, option of an instant, painless, effortless, guaranteed, permanent way out of life and existence. Therefore, life and existence is prison, torture, slavery, rape, and therefore, life and existence is survival of the stupidest. I'm going to kind of skip this section. They kind of just summarize how they got to this point and why they chose that sentence. I'm going to start here. There are only two types of people society, type A and type B. These can be summed up as follows. Type A people society. These people societies understand that everyone must be provided with the most fundamental of rights, which is the freedom, choice, option to move away from suffering in an instant, painless, effortless, guaranteed, permanent way whenever they want. This is obvious because if you do not have the right freedom to move away from suffering, then it would be legal for anyone to kidnap you and then imprison you in a basement where you are then raped and tortured on a daily basis for the rest of your entire life. I.e., in that basement, you would be going through intolerable pain, suffering, but you have no right to demand that you be allowed to leave that situation of suffering. I.e., the perpetrator is legally allowed to do anything that they want to you for the rest of your entire life. And therefore, it's obvious that this right freedom must exist in all aspects of life and at all levels of life existence. And, obviously, it must also be preventative. Therefore, the two main priorities of these people societies must be to 1. Make sure that all people entities have the freedom, choice, option to leave any situation of suffering, including life existence itself, in an instant, painless, effortless, guaranteed, permanent way whenever they want. 2. Not create new babies, entities, because they know that A. Any baby that is brought into existence will suffer regularly throughout its entire lifetime, i.e., they know that they need to be preventative of creating situations of suffering. And since life is inherently prison, torture, slavery, rape, suffering, from the moment that a baby is born, they know that it would be extremely immoral to bring a baby into existence. Indeed, it's obvious that it would be extremely immoral to do this because this would cause suffering, and they know that suffering is unacceptable and unnecessary. Note, the only people who are not able to truly recognize, admit this, that suffering is unacceptable and unnecessary, are all the selfish, immoral people because they need to keep, directly and indirectly, brainwashing, programming themselves and everyone to believe that suffering is acceptable and necessary because A. They have to do this because it's one of the main ways of keeping people trapped, enslaved, as their personal slaves and or work slaves. B. They have to do this to hide their selfish, immoral actions of controlling, manipulating, using, enslaving people, babies, children, adults, as their personal slaves and or work slaves. I will define personal slaves and work slaves later in this short discussion, short conclusion. Note, I say that their actions are selfish immoral because this is obvious and indisputable, because they are directly causing suffering to people, their personal slaves and or work slaves. And in most cases, that suffering will occur regularly for an entire lifetime, e.g., when they bring a baby into existence. Note, this book uses terms like bad, wrong, and selfish, immoral, cruel, evil, because these terms can be real, true, objective fact, and fair, equal, neutral, and not opinion based nor based on some agenda, if they're all naturally derived from the neutral, natural, true start point for everything. I'll explain this in detail in the summary. B. A baby cannot consent to be born, and therefore, the act of having a baby is non consensual, and therefore rape. Also, the Type A people society know that if one consensual act is allowed to happen, then many non consensual acts will start to happen. And this means that suffering will then spread to everyone. Type B people society. These people societies are selfish, immoral, because they only care about trying to use, enslave all people and entities as their personal slaves and or work slaves, and therefore they do all they can to make sure that no one is provided with the most fundamental of rights, the freedom, choice, option to move away from suffering in an instant, painless, effortless, guaranteed, permanent way whenever they want. And therefore, they try to restrict this freedom in all aspects of life and at all levels of life existence. Therefore, the two main priorities of these people societies are two. One, make sure that no one has the freedom, choice, option to leave life existence in an instant, painless, effortless, guaranteed, permanent way whenever they want. And to ensure this, they will invent, create, implement, and enforce many rules, beliefs, systems, legal, moral, social, interpersonal, personal, religious, spiritual, etc., in all aspects of life, which prevents this from happening. 2. Encourage, pressure, coerce, condition, brainwash, program everyone to do things that will, directly or indirectly, create new babies, entities, because they know that A. As soon as a person has a baby, that person is then part of the crime. And therefore, that person will then have to constantly brainwash, program themselves and everyone to believe that having a baby is good, moral, selfish, selfless, important, etc. Having a baby will bring you happiness, joy, love, etc. Suffering is acceptable, important, good, necessary, etc. Suffering is part of life, and therefore you, we, everyone must just accept it. Using, enslaving people as personal slaves and or work slaves is something that is acceptable, important, good, necessary, etc. Note, the aim of brainwashing programming is to be able to make people so blind that whilst they're looking at a black object, e.g. suffering, you'll be able to tell them that it's actually white and they'll believe you, rather than their direct experience of suffering. This is vital because only when you can control them on this level can you make them believe that A. they're not suffering, even whilst they're having the direct experience of suffering. And this means that you can continue to use them as your personal slave and or work slave. Or B. they are suffering, but they chose it and or want it and or need it for reasons XYZ. And this means that you can continue to use them as your personal slave and or work slave. B. If new babies entities are not created, then there will not be enough people to use as slaves, personal slaves and or work slaves, and this will make life for the type B people harder and or not as enjoyable, and or it will totally collapse their family, community, society, country, or whatever else. These things are the desires and fears of the type B people societies. And therefore, it is from these selfish desires and fears that all their actions will be based. And therefore, all actions from all type B people societies will always be inherently selfish and immoral. And therefore, there will always be suffering. Note, there is no middle ground between the type A and type B people, because all people either have this most fundamental of rights, freedoms, or they don't. And if they don't have this most fundamental of rights, freedoms, i.e., the freedom choice option to move away from suffering in an instant, painless, effortless, guaranteed, permanent way whenever they want, then they don't have any real true freedom, which must inherently mean that they're in a life which is inherently prison, torture, slavery, rape, whether physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual. Note, although the type A people society will do these things, as explained above, to reduce, prevent, eliminate suffering, it's not a hardship, nor something that they do unwillingly, because it's just something that they naturally do, because they just naturally do not want to cause suffering to any person, entity, being, dimension, anything. i.e., the type A people society aren't trying to be moral or whatever else. They just simply don't want any person, thing to suffer. However, the information above about reducing, preventing, eliminating suffering is only one part of the story. Indeed, it can only be one part of the story, because life has three key fundamental parts, desires to it, which are two. 1. Permanently reduce, prevent, eliminate suffering. 2. Get ever deeper freedom, peace, love, bliss. And 3. Get that, which is beyond happiness, pleasure, joy, ecstasy, etc., and beyond freedom, peace, love, bliss, and beyond all divine, godly, religious, spiritual experiences, and beyond beyond truth, identity, enlightenment, God, experience, self-realization, etc. In this book, I will use the word that, but some other people might call it, home, source, truth, etc. Note, I will talk about how to get that, or be as that, but the use of these words, terms, e.g., get, be as, etc., are all incorrect. However, they will have to do. Note, the type A people societies will want to make sure that all people, entities, things in existence get these three things. 1 points 1 to 3 above. There is one key fact about these three fundamental desires in life, and this will become obvious when a person is able to clearly, honestly look at everything in life existence. To see everything clearly, honestly, all you need to do is to see everything from the neutral, natural, true start point for everything, as will be explained in the summary of this book. I.e., by doing this, a person is not looking at everything in life in a skewed, biased, diluted, filtered way, due to their selfish desires, fears, delusions. So when this is done, the key fact about these three fundamental desires in life, which become obvious, is that all three of these things are pointing in the same direction towards the same conclusion, thing. And what this means is that no matter what aspect of life or level of life you start with, if you examine it with ever deeper honesty, there will be many superficial conclusions, realizations, which I will detail in the long conclusion. and they will all be pointing in the same direction, towards the same fundamental conclusion thing. An example of two of these superficial conclusions realizations are A. All types of society, life, existence are only in existence for selfish, malevolent reasons, purposes. B. The less that you cling to people, things, and existence, the more freedom, peace, love, bliss you will have in the long term. And these two superficial conclusions, realizations, like all other conclusions, realizations, are all pointing in the same direction towards the same fundamental conclusion thing, which is that all things in life are directing everyone towards that. Of course, this is to be expected, since that is something that solves the first two fundamental desires in life, as explained in points 1 and 2 above, because that is something which 1. Is 0 suffering, and 2. Is beyond freedom, peace, love, bliss. I.e., what this all means is that the only true freedom, peace, love, bliss is in as that. Of course, this is to be expected, because that is something which is beyond all people, things, experiences, feelings, sensations in existence. And beyond freedom, peace, love, bliss, and beyond existence itself. I.e., earlier in this conclusion, instead of saying that life has three key fundamental parts, desires to it, which are, I could have just said that life has one key fundamental part, desire to it, which is the desire for that. Indeed, this is all obvious. However, the key thing that most people are blind to, because they've blinded themselves to it, is the fact that the thing called that is non-existence. Note, non-existence is what remains in the absence of everything, including awareness, consciousness, lowercase I, capital case I, dimensions, realms, existence, etc. Therefore, non-existence is not a state of being where you are aware of the void, nothingness, etc., since awareness cannot exist in non-existence. Indeed, non-existence is not a state of being of any kind, since it is beyond all of this, and it's also beyond enlightenment, awakening, self-realization, liberation, non-duality, etc. Indeed, it's so far beyond all of these games nonsense that it can't be compared to any of it. Note, the reason why the word that is in quotes is because it's not a thing that exists, and indeed it can't exist, since that is that which remains in the absence of all things. The key point that I'm trying to emphasize is that the word that is in quotes, purely for this reason, and not for any other reason. I.e., it's not in quotes because it's some mystical thing which no words can describe. Yes, it's true, in a sense, that no words can describe it. However, this is only because it is not some thing that exists. However, this thing called that, it is not a mystery, since we do not know what it is. Since we do know what it is, since that is the absence of all things, which is the same as non-existence. And, yes, it's true, in a sense, that this thing called that is something which cannot be attained. However, this is not because it is something or some state of being, which is mystical, elusive, hard to attain, etc. I.e., the only reason why it cannot be obtained is because to attain something as a person need to exist. And that can only exist in the absence of all things, which therefore also includes you as a person, or as any other identity, e.g., consciousness, awareness, oneness, nothingness, everything, existence, non-existence, that, etc. Note, that last sentence did also include non-existence, and that. i.e., yes, it is true that when you strip away all the superficial and deep layers of a person, then what will remain is that non-existence. However, it's ridiculous to say I am that, because you cannot exist in that nor as that. However, that can exist by itself as non-existence. So, for all these reasons which I have just explained, it does still make sense to put the word that in quotes. However, just remember that the quotes are not there to say that that is something which you truly are, or whatever other similar attempt to claim a new identity. Nor are the quotes there to state that this thing is a mystery, or mystical, spiritual, divine, etc. Indeed, it's totally the opposite, since there is nothing simpler than non-existence. Note, there are many reasons why people are blind to this fact, that this thing called that is non-existence. And I'll explain all of them in the long conclusion. And I'll also explain why it's obvious that this thing called that is non-existence. And I'll also show how so many other things then also become obvious. E.g., it's obvious that all types of societies, life, existence are only in existence for selfish, malevolent reasons, purposes. Because if you wanted the ultimate freedom, peace, love, bliss, you wouldn't create babies, entities, life, existence, because the ultimate freedom, peace, love, bliss only exist in as that non-existence. Note, although some of this information, e.g. the sentence all types of societies, life, existence are only in existence for selfish, malevolent reasons, purposes, might sound too unrelatable, irrelevant in terms of reducing, preventing, eliminating suffering in normal everyday life, it's actually all totally relevant because it's actually this exact same issue that is causing all suffering in everyone's normal everyday life because 1. People are only staying in life existence for selfish, malevolent reasons, purposes. And 2. People are only creating babies, entities in life existence for selfish, malevolent reasons, purposes. These selfish, malevolent reasons, purposes are to use, enslave these newly created babies, children, and future adults as personal slaves and or work slaves. The definitions of these are as follows. A. Personal slaves. Personal slaves are babies, children, adults, which are used and slaves not for work purposes or reasons, but for personal reasons uses, i.e., if you have a relationship partner or friend, baby, child, family, etc., then they are your personal slaves because you're trying to get, control, manipulate, use, enslave a person. Whether that person is a baby, child, adult, in order to get things from them, e.g., happiness, love, money, entertainment, energy, attention, power, respect, sex, pleasure, affection, intimacy, a connection, popularity, image, identity, certain feelings, security, safety, stability, survival, peace, freedom, a family, a child, experiences, sensations, etc. Note, people only decide to have babies and relationships, friendships, families, etc. because they want some or many of these things. B. Direct work slaves. If you are enslaving a person not for personal reasons, but for work reasons, then that enslaved person is your work slave. This can be split into two categories, direct work slaves and indirect work slaves. Direct work slaves are children, adults who you directly use and enslave to do work, chores, jobs, etc., whether for some of the time or all of the time. A basic example of this is a housemaid, servant, slave. However, there are also many other examples, e.g., you force your children, when they're old enough, to be a slave, get a job, and do their own chores. Because this means that they're then doing their own job, work, chores to keep themselves alive, so that you can then continue to use them as your personal slave. But without you having to pay for things, food, water, shelter, etc., to keep them alive, or doing the basic chores which are necessary to keep them alive. C. Indirect work slaves. Indirect work slaves are people, entities that you want these people, entities to be constantly created, born, and kept alive because you want to use them to do work for you indirectly. E.g., you want people who you don't directly know to work, be a slave at jobs because you want to have electricity and water in your home, and to have food in shops and to have your trash taken away. And or you want other people to deal with certain things that you don't want to deal with yourself, e.g., dealing with dead people, old incapacitated people, sewage, making clothes, things in factories, etc. Note, this information about indirect work slaves is only half of the story, i.e., one half of the story is that people want babies to be constantly created, born, and kept alive so that they can be used as indirect work slaves. However, the other half of the story is that people don't just want this, but they also inherently want A. them to be brainwashed, programmed to get jobs. B. them to be brainwashed, programmed to not leave their jobs. C. a fail-safe system to make sure they do not and or cannot leave their jobs. D. them to be deeply brainwashed, programmed to believe that, as a matter of fact, that they should never kill themselves. I'll explain all of this in detail in the long conclusion. And the brainwashing programming will be so deep that they won't even know that it's been put inside them. This is always necessary because otherwise they would kill themselves. This is obvious because if a person can't escape a situation of suffering, which is going to last decades long, then they will want to escape from life. E. a fail-safe system to make sure that they can't kill themselves easily, i.e., if the brainwashing programming from the previous point starts to fail, then they may want to kill themselves. However, many of them won't do it if they can't get the equipment, medicine needed to kill themselves in an instant, painless, effortless, guaranteed way, i.e., the reason why they can't get this equipment, medicine, etc., is because it's been made illegal. Note, it's important to recognize and admit that these last 2 points, D and E, are not just what people want for their indirect work slaves, but also for their personal slaves. Moreover, most people's societies want all 5 of these points, A to E, not just for their work slaves, but also for their personal slaves. And 3, people are only forcing other people to stay in life existence for selfish, malevolent reasons, purposes. These reasons, purposes are to keep being able to use, enslave these newly created babies, children, and future adults as personal slaves and or work slaves. And, of course, this can only be done if they make sure that no one is provided with the most fundamental of rights, the freedom, choice, option to move away from suffering in an instant, painless, effortless, guaranteed, permanent way whenever they want. And I'll stop it here for the first video. We'll continue on page 13.